Hi everyone and welcome back to the My Favorite Things YouTube channel. This is Mindy Egan, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you how I watercolor this background using my Korean markers. I will be using the Baccarat Background from My Favorite Things. It is a red rubber stamp and it is foam mounted, so I made sure to remove the foam insert of my MISTI tool. Then I loaded that into my MISTI, picked it up with the door, and I will be using some Fabriano Artistico watercolor paper, and this is a 5x7 block. I'm just going to line this up over my stamp. I'm going to put a little bit of adhesive on the back, and then I'm going to close my MISTI kind of backwards. So I'm going to be picking the paper up with the bottom of my MISTI. This just ensures that I'm getting the placement that I had picked out, and it's not going to move because I put that little bit of adhesive on the back. Since I'm going to be doing some heat embossing first, I am making sure to prep this with an anti-static powder tool, and I want to make sure I get good coverage all over that watercolor paper. And then I'm inking this up with Versamark ink, so it's a clear sticky ink. Ink up the background, close the door of my MISTI, and make sure to push down on the entire background to get that even pressure. And I did stamp that 3 times in the Versamark ink because that watercolor paper is textured. Then I'm sprinkling on some white detail embossing powder, tapping off any excess over a scratch piece of paper, and then I'm going to bring my heat tool in, and going back and forth, I'm going to melt this embossing powder. I did have my heat tool warming up off on the side too for a minute or two. I want to make sure I'm bringing over my heat gun when it's nice and hot so it can quickly melt that embossing powder. And that's also going to lessen or minimize the amount of warping on my card. Now I'm bringing in just a flat cutting board, and I'm going to adhere this with some blue painter's tape or whatever you have handy, and I'm taping this along the very edge. I know that I'm going to end up trimming this panel down because that's what I really like to do, is to trim my panels down. So I'm not really concerned about the edge of this. I just want to make sure that this is really secure so that my paper doesn't warp as I add water to it. Once I have that secured down with that painter's tape, I'm going to bring in just a mister bottle. You can have any kind of water bottle you have here. This is just some clean water. And I'm going to wet my paper down, not too much. I just want it kind of damp. And I'll bring in a flat brush, paintbrush, and just spread that water around. This is kind of a wet on wet technique so that when my ink hits that paper, it's going to spread. Now I'm using the Korean markers, and the colors that I will be using, I'm going for some blues and greens, kind of a wintry mix. I have 264, which is Arctic blue. 189 is sapphire blue. 197 is plum. I have 377, which is ocean, and then a neon violet. And I pulled back my screen a little bit so you could see where I'm working. I'm just scribbling that ink down onto my glass media mat off on the side. And then I'm wetting my paintbrush, and I'm going to pick up that color and drop it right onto my wet background. It's hard to see with the light blue, but when we get to the darker colors, you're going to see what I mean. It kind of wicks out a little bit, so that's the wet on wet technique working, is that color is moving on its own just a little bit. So I'm just dabbing. There's no real rhyme or reason to this. Just dabbing in that color around the area, spreading it out across the cardstock. Now I'm going to clean my brush off and come in with some of that light green. And I'm going to be putting that right next to the blue. That is one thing I did try to keep in mind, is where my green is going to go, because if I mix that green and purple, it's not going to look very good. So I want to keep the blue next to the green. And then I can bring in the purple and tie that into the blues. So I am being a little bit mindful. I don't want to make mud, but I did want just a really nice soft blend between some of these colors. Normally watercolors, when they dry, they kind of dye back the color a little bit, but with these Korean markers, what I love about them is that they stay a really nice, a vibrant color. I could have come back and added more color when it was dry, but I was really happy with the outcome, which you'll see here in just a moment. Now I'm bringing in my water bottle again, and I just lightly spritz that a few times, picked up my board, kind of tilted that around to get that water moving a little bit. And because of those heat embossed lines, my color is going to kind of pool in some of those areas. Now I did set it off on the side to dry for a little while, but I'm also bringing in my heat tool and I'm waving that back and forth. I don't want to stay in one place too long because I don't want to reheat that embossing powder. Now also, if you make sure it's fairly dry before you pull the paper back, you're going to minimize the risk of ripping your paper. I'm also pulling that tape back on itself, which is another helpful tip when you're removing that tape from your watercolor paper. Now this wasn't completely dry, so I am going to still kind of go over that with my heat tool. I have it on the lowest setting. Just once again, kind of waving that around. You want to make sure this is completely dry before you start cutting it, or your edges are not going to have a clean cut to them. I trimmed my panel down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches, and off screen I die cut the I Really Miss You die out of black cardstock, but I'm only going to use the words miss you. I still wanted to show a lot of the background, but I love these big bold sentiments, and any of the large sentiments like this would work. So I'm just lining up about where I want them. You could also use your negative piece as a guide. And then I'm taking some liquid glue and I'm going to attach these letters right to the cardstock. I could also have cut these from some glitter cardstock. Gold or silver would have looked really pretty here. I just love the dramatic look of the black against that light colored background. And I think these colors would also work if you were looking to still make some holiday cards. Now to add a little bit of dimension to my card, I did cut out 2 more pieces of 110-pound cardstock measuring the same as my panel, so 3 3/4 by 5 inches, and I layered them together. This is just creating an even amount of dimension across that entire backing. And then I can add my front panel right on top of that, just using a strong tape runner to do that. And I'm going to add this to a white card front that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I really love that thick white margin against the contrast of all these colors that I have going on in my background. As a finishing touch, I'm going to go over all of the letters with this glitter gloss pen, and I just pressed on the barrel to get the liquid moving, kind of dabbed that off on some scratch paper, and this has kind of a paintbrush tip to it, so it's really easy to go over all of these letters and honestly quite relaxing. So just painting over all of those, this is going to add a really pretty glitter to it, and you could also add maybe some glossy accents if you really wanted to boost up that shine. So there, it's all finished. Here's a closer look at those colors and all of that sparkle. Really easy watercolor background to do, and the color variations to this are just endless. It's also a really great way to dig out your background stamps and use them some more. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you again soon.